Am I good enough? I was very hung up on proper technique and proper composition, and also trying to make images that other people would like and that people would approve of.
Hmm.
So my birds looked a lot like everybody else's birds, and my landscapes looked a lot like everybody else's landscapes. It took me some years to start realizing that I wasn't getting anywhere with that, and I was missing something essential in myself, and that was to really go out there and photograph, following my instincts and photographing how I feel about things instead of just what they look like.
Well, hey everyone. Welcome to episode 401 of F-Stop, Collaborate and Listen with your host, Matt Payne. One of my favorite things about this podcast is that I get to shine a light on photographers who are not super popular or famous, but they're doing some incredible work. This week's guest is one such example. Madeleine Lenagh just finished producing her book, Perpetual Motion, which is all about her relationship with the Dutch sea coast. We discuss her book project and how she's been able to produce consistent work that is deeply personal and for her and her alone. Before we get started, I wanted to thank our latest two podcast supporters on Patreon, Jeff Shiwi and Chris Wright, both former guests of this podcast. I've been considering moving the podcast to every other week due to a drop in support on Patreon, but these two latest supporters made me reconsider that for now. I'd love to see you help to keep the podcast going too. Just go to patreon.com/fstopandlisten and let your voice be heard that you'd like to see this project continue its weekly episodes. Thanks in advance for everyone who steps up to help out. Okay, let's get to this week's episode with Madeleine Lenagh. Madeleine Lenagh, it's great to have you on the podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, I feel like the last time that I saw your face was in a staff meeting for Nature First in like 2020 or something like that.
That's right. That's right. Probably, it would be 2020 because I joined and became an ambassador in 2019.
Yeah.
And then, yeah.
Yeah, so it's great to see you again, and I'm really excited to talk about your photography and talk about your awesome book project and all of the fun things that went into that. But first, before we do that, maybe let's have you kick us off by telling us a little bit about yourself.
Okay. I'm Madeleine Lenagh. I'm 75 years old, and I live in the Netherlands, but I was born and raised in the States, and came to the Netherlands in 1970, so more than 50 years ago. I have a far-flung family all over the world. I have two sons, one living very close to me here and one over in England in Sheffield. And I have three grandchildren whom I see very frequently because they live here, and I love being around them.
Perfect.
And these days, most of what I do is photography and other visual arts, but mostly photography.
Nice. And what brought you from the United States to the Netherlands?
Yeah, that's what actually happened was I had dropped out of college because I wasn't really sure what I wanted to major in. And so I decided I would take some time off and travel. And I convinced my parents to give me a trip to Europe for my 21st birthday. And I was traveling around Europe, and I didn't really feel like going back. And I found an au pair position in the Netherlands, very close to where I live now, for 6 months. And I never got around to leaving.
So you're an illegal immigrant.
Well, actually, I'm a Dutch citizen now.
Yeah. But back then you were like immigrating like after the fact kind of a thing.
Well, yeah, basically. And back then it was a lot easier than it is now.
Right. Yeah. No kidding. I'm sure. Yeah. I mean, there's been a lot of changes in the EU and all that fun stuff because of Brexit and things of that nature. But that's another podcast, I think. So how did you first get into photography?
Well, it sort of came in the family. My grandfather was a member of the New York Camera Club in the 20s, and both my mother and my uncle were avid photographers. My mother never went anywhere without this old Leica, the rangefinder, hanging around her neck. And another thing was she was a really good artist, and my grandmother was an artist, and I love being out in nature. I love being surrounded by beauty. I wanted to do something with that. And they said, yeah, you're left-handed. You can't draw.
Oh, wow.
So it wasn't quite like that, but they did a good job of convincing me that I could not draw. So, but when I was 18, my uncle gave me a camera. And I suddenly had this means to sort of go out and express myself with something visual, which was really wonderful. At first it was mostly, this was like the 60s. Mm-hmm. So it was mostly documenting the social unrest, the social turbulence that we were stuck in the middle of. And then when I got to the Netherlands, because I thought, I was going to go out there and either be a photographer or a filmmaker, and I got to the Netherlands and I ended up marrying a photographer, and I was so overawed by his work and by all these professional photographers in our circle of friends that I put away my camera and I didn't touch it for years.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. But then, yeah.
Let me let you in on a little secret. The thing that differentiates a professional photographer from an amateur is that we're the only ones that are dumb enough to try to make a living at it. So,
and you know what I learned from my marriage? That photography is a lousy way to make a living.
Yes, it is. But there is something to be said about making the thing that you love more than anything else your full-time evocation and putting your heart and soul into it.
Right.
And it's really, really hard to do in photography.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I get that entirely.
Yeah.
Now, we divorced in the beginning of the 80s, and I started photographing again, but at that point it was just a hobby. I had a full-time job. I had 2 kids. I had a busy life, and sometimes I'd take my camera out and I'd take it on trips and stuff like that. When I retired in 2012, and I'd actually, because I didn't want to get bored during retirement, I'd actually studied coaching and counseling and opened a counseling practice so that I'd have something to do after retirement.
Yeah.
And then I found out I didn't have time for clients because all I wanted to do was go out with my camera, and so all this insecurity and all the other barriers to expressing myself with a camera had just crumbled away, and I just from 2012 on, that's pretty much all I did.
Brilliant. And what were you doing for work before that?
I started out in urban renewal and local politics, and ended up working for municipal governments. And for the last 17 years of my career, I was senior project manager for the city of Utrecht, which meant I was running all these really exciting urban development and urban renewal projects, and it was a lot of fun. It was really, and what I also enjoyed doing was coaching other fellow project managers, which is how I sort of got into coaching and counseling.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay, so lots of, project management. I've done a fair amount of that in my time. It's a lot of like following processes and having timelines and Gantt charts and like rules and making sure things are lined up and like making sure that everyone who's supposed to be doing this knows that these people are doing that, and so there's a lot of coordination. Did you find that it was also a creative outlet for you?
Yeah, I was a very different kind of project manager.
Gotcha.
I was the one that would go into like really difficult situations, and put together a team of people that probably weren't going to agree with each other, and I would sort of get them so excited about what we were going to make that they suddenly all started working together, and so and I was a lot better at getting projects moving and getting them defined and getting all the specifications defined, and then sort of when they went into the executive phase, I'd sort of leave that to someone who was better at it.
Gotcha. That sounds fun. Yeah. Let's dive into the photography side of things. So fast forward to 2012, or I guess get in the time machine and go back to 2012. What did you find yourself originally most drawn to as a photographer? Like, what were your subjects? What were your techniques? What was your approach to making images?
Well, it was all about, most of it was about nature and landscape. I mean, I've always loved nature, and as a kid, I was very happy alone in the woods and making up my own stories and stuff like that. And so basically, I was just going out into nature and photographing what I loved. But I was very hung up on, am I doing it right? Am I good enough? And so I was very hung up on proper technique and proper composition and all that other stuff, and also trying to make images that other people would like and that people would approve of. Mm-hmm. So my birds looked a lot like everybody else's birds, and my landscapes looked a lot like everybody else's landscapes. And it took me some years to start realizing that I wasn't getting anywhere with that, and I was missing something essential in myself, and that was to really go out there and photograph, following my instincts and photographing how I feel about things instead of just what they look like.
Wow, there's a lot to unpack in what you just said, because I think almost every single photographer I've ever talked to eventually goes through this struggle. Like, I still go through this struggle. I mean, every time I go out, I'm like, am I making this photograph for myself, or is this like what I think people will like? And it's this constant battle with yourself. And I loved what you said about, am I good enough? Because I still ask myself that same question all the time. So, I think that's part of the artistic process as well. Is you have the ego, and you have all these self-doubts, and you have all of these external people telling you what's good and what's not good, and it's hard to separate out what the noise is. So I'm curious, kind of looking in the rearview mirror, what were the steps that you took to improve your photography and to silence some of those voices and to kind of hone in on what you actually wanted your photography to be about?
I think a lot of it was sort of casting around and finding other photographers who were doing something that felt right to me. And also, actually, one of the things that really helped was that I started painting as well. And my paintings were all very abstract.
Right.
And I was trying to figure out why I could express myself much better through painting than through photography, even though I loved photography. So there was that. That definitely played a role. And then finally meeting up with some photographers who really ticked all my boxes, where I thought, but this is important. I have to pay attention to this. And of course then, he'll come up in our conversation anyway. Theo Bosboom was a very important one, because I followed a few workshops with him and then did some mentoring with him. And that really gave me the self-confidence to follow my own track.
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like that's the role that a good mentor can play, and is kind of releasing those expectations and giving you permission to follow your own path, even if that path looks messy and maybe looks weird from the outside. Like you get kind of a green light to just go and see where it takes you.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's very much that giving you permission and saying, no, what you're doing isn't stupid. Just listen to it, go for it.
Right.
And that really helped. And I found, and the interesting thing is that as I started doing that, then I suddenly found more people from the people who mattered, the people who I thought had the right idea about art and photography, and they were paying more attention to my work as well. So obviously something was happening that was good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I've always found that when someone releases those external validators and just focuses on internally what speaks to them and what motivates them and the subjects and the techniques and the types of images that speak from within ourselves uniquely, I feel like once people start to really harness in and hone in on that approach, it starts to look different and it starts to differentiate itself from the rest of what other people are doing, and people take notice of that, right? Because it's different and it's personal and it's unique. And so I think it's really exciting to see people like you do that and go through that journey. What types of photographs do you find yourself making today versus what you were initially creating?
Well, a lot more abstract work.
Okay.
And I'm no longer afraid to do a multiple exposure or a composite photograph, because I used to be like, oh no, you can't do that. That's not real nature photography. But no, I'm an artist, and I have freedom of artistic expression, and so a lot more of that, and I'm a lot more relaxed in the field than I used to be. So, and I think that's one of the reasons the images coming back are different, because there's wonderful story of how I went out during the blue hour when I was taking photos for this book, and so early morning, hardly any light, and I get to the location, and I realize I have no tripod.
All right.
And I think, well, that's interesting. I guess I'm just going to have to do ICM.
Right.
And so I came back with a bunch of wonderful ICMs for that from that shoot.
Yeah. And
so I
was going to say, a lot of times those barriers or those limitations force us to become more creative because we're not having to rely on the tools that we normally use to make images. And necessity is the mother of invention. So
yeah, absolutely. And thinking back to your question, I think another factor, of course, was that I didn't have to earn a living doing it. So I was under less pressure, and still am, though, except of course that book cost a lot of money. But I'm under much less pressure than photographers who have to earn a living with their photography.
Yeah, it's a big relief to not have to rely on your photography to make an income, and it certainly takes away some of the requirements, some self-imposed requirements that people create for themselves in terms of monetization. It's interesting. I was having a conversation in a Discord server I'm on called Landscape Photographers Worldwide, and we were talking about this photographer in La Jolla who has a gallery, and everyone was commenting about how terrible the images looked, and they were all like these composite mashups, and like everyone was like, gosh, if that was my photography, I would be so embarrassed. There's no way I could put that in my gallery. And another person came in, Richard Wong, actually, who's been on this podcast, and he said, well, if your entire income and livelihood was depending on making money off selling prints to wealthy people in La Jolla, and the types of images that we're selling were these images that we're discussing, you might make an exception for yourself. And I think it was kind of silenced the room a little bit. Like everyone was like, I didn't think about that. And you're probably right.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think having to depend on photography for your income definitely forces some people to make interesting choices. Let's just say that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, because I can't imagine. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I can't imagine that this particular individual enjoys this stuff. Because if you go to this guy's website, he has like a whole gallery section for like artist favorites, and it's like nothing like what's in his gallery. So it's like obvious that he's creating these things for the gallery that he knows are going to sell, but that he actually really enjoys this other photography that probably won't sell. So I think it's important.
That is interesting.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's a lot of that goes on in the industry as well. But it's interesting that you brought it up as someone who recently worked on a book project.
I think we will get to that, because it took me a while to be convinced myself that I was going to go for that.
Yeah. Trust me, I know. So what recommendations do you have for other people who are looking to hone in on their area of interest in photography, like other than giving themselves permission to silence the external voices?
Well, I think that's the most important one.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think another one would be, I'm not a gearhead, and I sometimes have to laugh at people that are constantly buying the newest of the newest and trading in their old stuff and thinking, does it really improve your work? Does it really make a difference? Or is it, if you find something that works for you, you can stay with it. But I think the most important one is to photograph for yourself, and not photograph for what you think other people expect from you.
I couldn't have said it better myself, and I think one thing I would add to that is kind of going along those same lines of photographing for yourself. I think that's a kind of a statement a lot of people throw out there. Maybe doesn't have enough definition or guidance around it. And what I would say to people is think about the subjects or the things that you're most drawn to, whether it's oceans or moving water or forests and trees or mountains and deserts or whatever it is, and like lean really heavily into it and allow yourself to get super creative and funky, right? Like,
yeah,
there's no bad photograph. Like, it's all just practice, and eventually it's like scaffolding. You're gonna make a lot of really bad photographs of that subject, but then eventually those are all learning experiences, and then you're gonna come up with all these little ideas through that process, and then through that you're gonna make better versions of those ideas, and eventually, like 3-4 years later, you're gonna make like a really amazing version of that original idea that the outcome wasn't good, but the idea was good. So anyways, I like to talk about that subject a lot.
Well, that's another bit of advice I would give almost everyone, and that's to work in projects. Focus on a theme and go out there again and again and again, and go deeper and deeper and deeper. Spend more time just exploring one thing. That's a wonderful way to do it. And don't be disappointed if you go out and take 200 shots and there's only one good one. That
seems
one.
good. That seems good to me.
Yeah, exactly.
I was gonna say I recently did 15 days in Colorado here for fall color. I came home with 10,000 exposures, which included a lot of auto bracketing for my drone and a lot of focus stacking. So obviously it's an exaggerated number. But out of those 10,000 exposures, I created 120 images that I liked, which I don't know, what is that, like 1.2%? So yeah, exactly.
Sounds good.
Yeah, sounds great, right? Yeah, exactly. Well, let's get to the meat of this. Let's talk about your book that you just finished self-publishing. You've titled it Perpetual Motion. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much for sending me a copy of the book. Let me just first say, I love it. It feels like a very personal and introspective piece of work. It came from the heart and came from the soul. Tell us about what inspired you to create the book, and what is it about, and how you went about creating it. I know that's a lot.
Yeah, that's a lot. Well, I just mentioned working in projects. and I'd done that in previously. And I recently moved house 3 years ago back to where I started out in the Netherlands, near Haarlem, which is very near the beach. And I love the sea. I have a whole history with the sea, and I love it. And I started going down to the beach at all hours with my camera and just sort of photographing whatever caught my attention. And I finally decided, okay, this is going to turn into a project. I'm just going to do this for a while and go deeper and deeper and see what pops up. And gradually I realized that what was really attracting me was the fact that, I mean, the Dutch seacoast is about the most boring landscape you can imagine. It's just flat sand and water. And then, of course, there's sky and there's winds and there's tides and there's waves and it has the most amazing moods and changes of moods. It's never the same. It's always different. You can go to the same spot and you get entirely different photographs. And it was the changing moods that really struck me. And I'm someone with lots of changing moods myself. And so I could connect to this landscape. There was something about the landscape that said something about me. So I decided, so this is going to be the focus of the project. Well, after a while, I collected quite a few of these images, and I showed them to Theo Bosboom, and he went through them, and he said, we talked about it a couple of times. He said, you'd really need to make a book of this. And I thought, no, I'm not going to make a book. I did publish a book back in 2015, but it wasn't a photography book. It was an autobiography. And I knew, making a book is fun, but selling it.
I was going to say, like, some people would argue that making a book is also not fun, but that's a whole other conversation.
Yeah, well, okay, well, I mean, I really enjoyed that part of it, but I was rather overwhelmed by the idea. And Theo said, that's okay. I'll coach you through the things you have to know, and I can help you do the image selection and the sequencing. And so he talked me through a lot of stuff and about self-publishing. I mean, I did consider going to a publisher, but the publishers are very hard to find for photo books, and there are more people making photo books than there are publishers willing to publish them. So
not only that, but like, it's not probably the most economically wise move. Like, I mean, you're gonna make like $3 a book, whereas if you self-publish, you can actually make back your investment. If you sell, depending on how you price it, you can make back your investment after maybe selling a quarter or half of the books, which isn't too bad. Yeah.
So I finally decided, okay, I can do it. I can self-publish. And at a certain point, he took me to meet his printer, the printer who does all his books. And we had a talk about, the printer looked at the images and was really enthusiastic. And we talked about paper, and we talked about covers, and we talked about, just general what it could look like. And I came back from that meeting just really excited, thinking, yes, because if I'm going to put a lot of money into making a book, I want it to be beautiful.
Yes.
So that, I mean, I'm not going to go just do some inexpensive publication, but that's not what it's for. It's because, let me see if I can say this right. Otherwise my images will just end up on the hard disk of my computer, social media, some photography forums, and that's not going to make me happy. I wanted something to hold in my hands and be proud of and share with people that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, no, there's
Yeah.
something to be said for that, for sure. And it kind of like closes the loop in terms of the whole creative process. I feel like 95% of photographers never get to close that loop, whether it be printing their photography large or creating a book
Right.
project or something like that. So I think it's
Right.
an
Yeah.
important step in the creation process.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, definitely. And I love printing. I love printing my photographs. I love having them printed, and I have been talking to some galleries about having them exposed.
Exhibited?
Exhibited. Yes, that's the word I was looking for.
You had the Dutch word in your head. I see. So it's interesting that you already had published an autobiography, and in a lot of ways, it sounds like your photography book is also an autobiography of sorts in terms of maybe a deeper or more emotional side of things, and kind of leaning into that minor white quote that every photograph is a self-portrait. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about the image selection process and kind of how you organized the work, relating back to the fact that you mentioned that the Dutch seacoast is very similar to you in terms of changing moods and things like that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, if that was going to be the main theme of the book, then obviously any sequencing would have to do justice to that. But both Theo and I felt it should be a pretty intuitive process. And so we'd sort of take turns doing a mock-up. He'd do one, he'd pass it on to me. I think, those double-page spreads, those are really cool. And then I'd do one, and I'd send it back to him, and we'd sort of bounce it back and forth. And at the end of the process, just in time to send everything off for the first trial print, there was an obvious sequence that was moving from one type of image, one type of mood to the other. We had soft, foggy parts and stormy parts. There's very much a sort of climax at one point in the book with stormy seas sort of coming up and then leaving again and then moving towards quieter images again. And so that was basically, that's how. And then I had to decide, do I want text? And I thought, well, the text could be supporting those shifts in mood.
Right.
And so I wrote a few little things too. I didn't want the text to overwhelm the images, but I call attention away from the images, but I wanted them, the bits of text, to be supportive, to show where moods were changing and where different themes were coming in.
I was going to say, I definitely felt like there was kind of a crescendo that happened about, halfway through the book, where the images got a little darker and a little bit moodier and a little bit more, like, because choice of shutter speed and whatnot, but like a little bit more action oriented versus like softer and quieter. I definitely noticed that and felt that, but it wasn't until you started talking about it that it immediately struck me that that's what you were trying to accomplish. And hearing you say that now makes me feel a little stupid, but I love that was kind of how you did it. Well,
thank you. Thank you. I didn't want to really this is chapter 1, this is chapter 2, this is chapter 3. I wanted a pretty intuitive flow.
Yeah. And maybe, it doesn't hit you over the head, is I guess what I'm trying to say. It's like it's this subtle kind of gradation from soft and quiet to moody and dark and action oriented and back to soft and quiet again. So almost like a symphony of sorts, I guess.
Yeah. That's a good comparison. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, for me, looking through the book, I feel like, there's a very, very, very cohesive element to your book. Obviously, the subject is very niche and consistent, right? It's water, it's the Dutch coast, it's oceans and waves and sand and everything that you can find on the beach. How did you find ways to differentiate the content without deviating too far from the overall theme?
I can remember at one point I was coming up with a lot of wave photos. I could photograph waves all the time.
Yeah.
They're so much fun. There's so many different ways to do them, and they reflect light, and they do all kinds of great things. But obviously, it was going to be a very boring book if all it was waves. I mean, only Rachel Talbot can do something like that, and get away. And she does wonderfully. But that wasn't going to happen, and especially not in the Dutch coast, where the waves aren't that spectacular either. And so, one thing was a matter of saying, what belongs in the book: textures, sand textures, skies, waves. But also, there's a whole Dutch coast, and there are things that are really typical of the Dutch coast, like wooden pilings that stretch out into the sea and protect the sea from the coast from currents, or marram grass, which protects the dunes environment. Obviously, you've got lots of seabirds and stuff like that, though it was very important not to make anything like birds or people the subject of a photo. They could be there, but they weren't supposed to be the subject of the photo. But there were locations like the Waddenzee, which is this stretch of water between the actual coast and a ring of islands on the north, like the Florida Keys, very similar. And it falls entirely dry at low tide. And then comes up again. And so you've not only got fabulous mud structures, but you can go out there in the middle of the Waddenzee in a flat bottom boat, and you can fall dry at night and then watch the water coming up again in the morning. And that sort of thing was unique. So that had to be in the book.
Right. Yeah.
So it was sort of looking at different types of within the parameters of the Dutch seacoast, different types of landscape, and everything from wide to very intimate.
Yes, and everything in the book is Dutch seacoast. I'm curious, are we talking 20-mile stretch, 1,000-mile stretch? Like, what is the geographic extent of the images
that I made? I'm not sure what the geographic extent is of the Dutch coast. I'd have to look that up. But I made images from the very northern section, so the North Sea side of an island, all the way down to the southern side of Zeeland, which is almost at the Belgian border.
Okay.
And yeah.
I just looked it up. It's only 280 miles long.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't do the entire 280 miles, and there were actually some locations that just didn't work for me.
Sure.
But I did go all the way from north to south. Yeah.
Well, the reason I was asking the question is that one of the things I really appreciated about your project is how hyper local the project is, and the fact that you were able to create this diverse body of work close to home. I think there's this kind of misperception out there in landscape photography that you have to travel all over the nether regions of the planet in order to create amazing photographs. And obviously, if your thing is photographing volcanoes or, I don't know, the highest mountains in the world or whatever your thing is, like, you're going to have to travel to do it. But if your thing is more focused on kind of personal expression and wrapping up an image with kind of how you feel that day or how that subject is making you feel, then you can do it right in your backyard. Exactly.
And that is also one of the messages in the book, and I haven't really made it explicit except in a very small bit of text.
Yes.
That it's really about just staying close to home and just looking and looking at very ordinary things and paying attention. And if you pay attention, there's so much you can discover in those. You don't have to travel across the world to get these fabulous, spectacular things, unless that floats your boat. But that's not the kind of photographer I am.
It's so funny that you brought this up because So on my fall photography trip, I was probably 200 miles from my house for this particular day I'm about to talk about. And I found this cattle ditch that is in this aspen forest. And what was really cool about it is that the water is consistently flowing a very slow pace. And all of these aspen leaves are falling into the water. And I was just having a hoot, just following the aspen leaves and photographing them as they pass by me with different reflected light, like different, the reflection of the blue sky or the yellow and orange trees above them, things like that, and with the leaves below. And that was really, really, really fun. And I was like, man, this is an amazing location. And then yesterday, I walked 2 blocks to my son's high school. And on my way home, I took a different route. And I crossed over this bridge, and below me was this creek full of running water and aspen leaves. And I was like, I guess I could have done it right down the street.
Yeah, yeah.
But I wasn't paying attention to it before. So now I'm like, if I ever want to try that again, I just need to walk 2 blocks and I can do it.
Well, a lot of it is about paying attention, I think. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Really important.
Yeah. And as you and I both been involved with the Nature First, we know that that this urge that photographers have to go out there and put their tripod feet in the same spot as that wonderful photograph that they'd seen somewhere else, that's also destroying beautiful landscapes. So it's not only good for me, it's not only good for my photography, I'll speak for myself, and for also my mindful way of living to stay close to home, but it's also good for the environment.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I can argue against that. So back to the book project, I'm curious if you could speak a little bit about what the most challenging aspects were in creating the book.
Oh, the logistics. Anything that didn't have to do with the creative process.
Yeah.
I had to build a web shop and attach it to my website and sort of set up book sales, pre-sales on the web shop, and which meant I had to understand everything about sales tax and postage, shipping costs, and I don't know what. And I managed to crash the website at one point when sort of struggling with the software. I had to set up a business because I did want to be able to distribute the books to bookstores through the central distribution point in the Netherlands. And you have to be a publisher to do that. So I needed to have a business that was registered and also as a publishing company. And and of course then just having that business and having to report things to the tax office every quarterly and that sort of stuff. That was all, it didn't have anything to do with making the book.
Right, yeah.
I had to figure out what boxes to use because I wanted the books to fit through mail slots. And and at a certain point I had a whole pile of boxes waiting for the books. And so the one thing after another. And I'm seriously not very good at going out there and saying, buy my book. It's really worthwhile.
I was going to say, I don't know hardly any photographers who are good at that, so you're not alone.
It's way out of my comfort zone. But it was sort of take, one step after the other. And I think that you sort of have to just take that in your stride and not let it disturb you, not let it distract you from the really fun part of making a book.
What a perfect segue. So what were the most rewarding aspects of creating the book?
Well, going out there day after day taking photos, but also designing the book was so much fun. I taught myself to use desktop publishing software, and so I set up exactly how I wanted the book to look like, and then doing the back and forth process with Teo, just sort of choosing images and what would happen if we threw that in there, and why doesn't that belong in there, and that sort of thing is just. I'm glad I didn't do it alone, and I don't think you should do it alone. I
Yeah.
think you always need someone to go back and forth with.
Collaborate.
Well, yeah, collaborate, definitely.
Yeah.
I was thinking more like table tennis, but that's
Yeah, volley back
Yeah.
and forth. Yeah, totally.
yeah, yeah,
So-
yeah.
So, how many images are in the book?
61.
61. And what was your pool of images that you started with?
400.
Oh,
400
man.
something.
Oh, that must have been so painful.
Well, there a lot of darlings got killed, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And that I think that's where having somebody else help is so important, because I feel like if I were to do something like that on my own, I would keep my favorite photos in that maybe they're great photos, but maybe they just don't work on that page, or they don't work in the book. So
Exactly.
that's the
Yeah.
important part of having someone else look at it.
Yeah, yeah. And especially when you've got 2 pages across from each other,
Oh yeah.
and you want 2 images and you want them to fit together just right. Yeah.
Well, and especially, I feel like this underscores the importance of kind of the thematic thing we talked about with your book in terms of it being more like an orchestra. I feel like if that's your kind of format that you've kind of landed on, it helps you synthesize image selection and where you put those images. Whereas obviously, if your structure of your book was more chapter based, the selections would be completely different.
Very possible. Very
Yeah.
possible. And well, especially if the chapters were based on other things too, like
Sure.
locations or whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. So what advice do you have for other people who are looking to create a similar body of work for a book?
Well, I think you need to be clear on exactly why you want to do it, and doing it so because you could sell it is not a good reason to do it, because you're going to be working really hard to sell it, unless you're such a popular photographer that anything you do is turns to gold. I mean, there are people.
That's not me.
But and you have to, basically, it's like my advice to photographers: do it primarily for yourself,
Yeah.
because you want to make something that you yourself are really proud of.
Mm-hmm.
And don't get bogged down by all the stuff that you have to do as well. And that's and that can, I mean, that sounds. Did I get bogged down? I did a couple of times. I had a couple of sleepless nights, but I'll tell you, with getting the CMYK color proofs,
Oof.
getting them just right.
Yeah, that's hard.
That's it's not an easy job, and I was really nervous when the book finally went to press, and to see when good, they came out exactly the way they're supposed to come out.
Yeah, I mean,
But,
the good news about
yeah.
CMYK conversion is that there's only certain colors that are primarily affected, like in a significant fashion, and as long as you know that, then once you come across those images, you just know that you have to pay closer attention to those images versus some of the other ones. And then also,
True. Yeah.
if you use Lightroom and you can use you can soft proof and you can see what the CMYK is going to do,
Yeah.
then you can kind of tweak it. So
Sort of.
you can get close.
You can get close, and I unfortunately my printer was willing to do a full photo proof, like one huge page, basically, with images the size that they were in the book, and we took the images that would be tricky. and but do that on the offset machine.
Oh,
Not do a
nice.
proof,
Yeah.
not do a computer proof, but really do the proof on the offset machine. So so I could see, and that showed me that some images, especially the warmer images, were a little too cool, and some of the images needed a bit more texture and that sort of thing. And so and then I had to trust myself to get it right, because
Yeah.
then I didn't have another chance. That's yeah.
That's right. That's right. So, what is the time horizon for the body of work? Like, what are the dates in terms of the images that are in the book?
None of the images are older than the spring of 21, I guess.
Okay. Wow. So it's all pretty recent.
Yeah, yeah. And that has to do with my move to where I live now and moving close to the beach.
Right.
That's when
Okay.
I started the project.
Okay. And what was the kind of general time frame that you committed to creating the book project?
Well, I stalled for a long time on really committing to the book project. But this last spring, when we paid a visit to the printer, I said, okay, we're going to go
Okay.
visit the printer, and if that feels good, I'll do it.
All right. So spring
And
of 2023.
no, 2024.
2024. Wow. So you moved
Yeah.
fast. You moved very quickly.
Yeah. So that was like in April.
Okay.
And then we set up a time schedule. And I said something like, oh, well, the book can be out by the end of the year. And Teo said, well, I'm sure November will be fine. And I'd say, okay, November. And then the printer would say, well, if you get the proofs to me, if you get the images to me by, what was it, beginning of August, then then we can get the book out by the beginning of October. And I thought, oh, okay, beginning of October. That's
Wow.
and
Yeah.
that's but and I worked really hard on the design and on getting the images right and stuff like that. It was really it's been pretty much taking up most of my time for this entire year.
Yeah. Yeah. I can imagine. And then, what you said you used some desktop publishing software. What did you choose to use?
I went for InDesign
Okay. Yeah.
because I have an Adobe package, and I thought that would
Sure.
be compatible. Later, I found out I could have used Affinity, because I wasn't really doing the super intricate stuff that you can do with InDesign. I mean, something a little simpler would have worked, but it's fine. I had fun using it.
And what
Yeah.
was that learning curve like for you?
Intense.
Yeah.
Intense, and it was sort of, and I'm very focused when I'm learning something new. I don't have to know everything as long as I know how to do what I need to do.
Right. Okay.
And in retrospect, some of the things I did, I could have done better. I could have worked with more preset type of things, but there were things I could have done more efficiently, but it worked.
Yeah. I feel like that's the biggest barrier that people face, or at least in their mind, like, oh, I have to learn a whole new software. And it's like, well, if you use Lightroom and Photoshop already, I feel like InDesign is like not that much further of a step. I mean, it's obviously way different, but like some of the tools and stuff are fairly similar. So I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, there are always these frustrating moments that I think, why isn't it doing what I want it to do?
Oh, yeah.
But for me, WooCommerce was a much bigger learning curve than InDesign.
Oh, yeah.
That was really that had me flabbergasted more than once.
I bet. Yeah, we use WooCommerce for the Natural Landscape Photography Awards books, and it took me a minute to wrap my head around how that works.
Right.
Because, you have to set up all the taxes and the shipping, and yeah, it's not totally simple.
No, it isn't at all.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's when I lost 12 orders because I did something and blew up the site and hadn't backed up properly. I hadn't backed up for a couple of days, but a lot of orders were coming in.
Oh.
Fortunately, I had them all on email.
Yeah.
So, but I always had to remember, hey, you've got some orders on email in an email that aren't on the website, and don't forget them. Yeah.
Yeah, that's rough.
That's...
All right, Madeleine. Well, this has been awesome. I highly encourage people to take a look at your book. What's the best way for people to get their own copy?
Unless you're in the Netherlands, the best way is through my website, which is www.lenagh.nl, not .com, but NL. And I'm very prompt at sending them out.
And that's Lenagh spelled Lenagh.
That's right.
All right.
That's right.
Okay.
And
last question. Who do you recommend for the podcast? Who are a couple of photographers that inspire you?
Well, there are a couple of Dutch photographers who do really interesting stuff and probably haven't hit the international spotlight that much. And one is Elvis Dali.
Yes.
Who does wonderful landscape work, very, very partially abstract, and I really love his work. And the other one is somebody who does a lot of macros, which is something I never do, but I really admire what she does. And she's Pauline van Boonskoek, and she just did a fabulous series on butterflies that are all on the red list.
Oh, okay.
So vanishing rapidly, and just gorgeous, very high key images, really well done, just beautiful.
Yeah, I feel like macro is like a whole other world of insanity that, man, once you go down that rabbit hole, it's a long and deep hole.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I have the excuse that I can't get down on my knees easily, so I try to take photos standing up.
I think that's good advice just for everyone.
Yeah.
Well, Madeleine, this has been so much fun, and it's been great to reconnect and to finally talk about your photography and your book, of course.
Yes, well, thank you. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed talking to you, and it's good to just be able to put my ideas out there.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Well, thank you to Madeleine for joining me on the podcast this week. I had a great time speaking with you, and I hope listeners got a lot out of our conversation. I'd love to hear from listeners about the things that we discussed this week, and the best way to do that is to join Patreon for free and leave a comment on this week's show notes there. Just go to patreon.com/fstopandlisten and drop a note in the comments for this week's show. See you there. Also, if you have an idea for a podcast episode and you want to tell your story to the world, please don't be shy. I have a form on my website for you to pitch your idea. I'll leave links to all of these things in the show notes. Cheers. Thanks for stopping in, collaborating with us, and listening. See you next week.